Thanks, Deputy Speaker. This bill is an attempt to reform the slot management at Sydney Airport following extensive criticism of the current system. It's an amendment to the original legislation that put in a cap and curfew at Sydney Airport. Sydney communities fought hard to get that cap and curfew in the 1990s. They're not perfect, but they are effective and they protect Sydney residents from the worst of flight noise from their airport. But we see now the government preserving and protecting the cap and curfew at Sydney Airport, and the Greens have moved an amendment calling on the government to consider a cap and curfew for other Brisbane airports, including Brisbane. We ask again, if it is good enough for Sydney, then why is it not good enough for Brisbane? Why is it that Sydney gets a cap and curfew, but Brisbane gets none of those protections? All we're asking for are reasonable reforms and regulations, not to shut down the airport. All we're asking for is exactly what Sydney has. Brisbane Flight Path Community Association recently ran their Community Pulse survey of 1,600 residents, and they found some pretty shocking results. Because as Libby and Stephen, or members for Ryan and Brisbane, have said, the impact of flight noise and flight noise pollution on residents across Australia is devastating. It is not a trivial issue. It has serious impacts on health, physical health, mental health, and as we found out from recent surveys, independent health surveys in Melbourne can also affect childhood development. But here's what this survey found. 94% of the 1,600 respondents said their sleep was disrupted by aircraft noise. 53% at least twice a night. 66% of respondents said they were considering moving home to avoid flight noise, though many of them feel trapped and can't afford to. 57% said they have physical symptoms of stress caused by aircraft noise. These are devastating impacts on the people being impacted by this issue in Brisbane, but also residents across Australia being impacted by flight noise and flight noise air pollution. The only real substantial shift that has been achieved with regards to reducing the impact of flight noise in Brisbane has been secured by the Greens, where we have secured an amendment or a direction from the Minister to ensure that SOD props, in other words, flights departing and arriving over the water, is the preferred operating mode 24 hours at Brisbane Airport. This is the first big shift that we have seen since the second runway was proposed at Brisbane Airport. The question everyone asking is, why is it so hard to get reasonable regulations? Qantas and Virgin certainly wield enormous amounts of power over our political system and functionally act like a duopoly similar to Coles and Woolworths, and we have seen their political power and the impact that it has on decisions that are made in Parliament. Tinkering around the edges with slot reform won't fix the fundamental issues with Australian aviation industry that is highly concentrated, monopolised market that pursues corporate profit over communities, customers and workers. When they were in government during the pandemic, the Coalition gave $2.7 billion in taxpayer subsidies to Qantas that were never repaid. They still fired 10,000 workers, including 1,700 illegally, as found by the High Court. In the financial year 2022-23, Qantas recorded a profit of $2.47 billion, yet paid no income tax by bringing forward the losses from the pandemic. Shouldn't they be repaying those subsidies then that were paid to them by the federal government? We know in Queensland, when it comes to flight noise, that the Queensland government, the previous government, was subsidising late-night flights, 50 a week or thereabouts, to the tune of $100 million. Those are flights flying inside what should be a curfew period, and not only is the federal and state government refusing to support a curfew, they're actually funding flights to fly during what should be a curfew period. This includes the 1:55 a.m. Emirates flight. Emirates, who just recorded a $4 billion profit, is getting paid by the Queensland taxpayer to fly flights at the middle of the night, disrupting people's sleep. We saw the proposed third runway at Melbourne Airport, because it's not just Brisbane. An independent health study commissioned by Council found that by impacting sleeping patterns, it could potentially lead to increased rates of cardiovascular disease and may affect children's cognitive development. In fact, those zones that were most impacted by overnight flights and that could be impacted by the third runway found that children could experience a delay in reading and oral comprehension of between 3 and 5 months compared to children in lower noise areas. It makes you wonder what impacts that the flight noise in Brisbane is having on Brisbane residents where they are already exposed to it. All the Greens are proposing is we have some fair and reasonable regulations on airports across Australia, including at Brisbane. All we are proposing is a curfew and cap similar to Sydney Airport. All we are proposing is a little bit of balance, because right now what we have is an airline industry that maximises profits at the expense of everyone else. And all we're proposing is we find some balance between the profitability of the airline industry, the need to service people across Australia, and also the impacts it will have on communities. Because going forward right now, Brisbane Airport hopes to double flight traffic by 2035. That is not just unsustainable when it comes to flight noise. It's unsustainable when it comes to air pollution in the city. It's unsustainable when it comes to meeting our climate and CO2 reduction targets. It's unsustainable on every level except for the bottom line of Brisbane Airport Corporation and the profit margins of Qantas and Virgin. Are we really going to allow our political system to sacrifice the needs of ordinary Australians just to help pad the profit margins of Qantas, Virgin and Brisbane Airport Corporation?
Authorised by J. McCall, Australian Greens, Canberra.